What would you do if the only inheritance you had left in the world was a key? A key to a place no one had entered for a generation, a place the world had written off as a failure. For just £3, Harriet Mercer bought herself a tombstone, a shuttered, failed curiosity museum in a town that wanted nothing to do with her. But what the town didn't know, what no one could have possibly guessed, was that the building's greatest curiosity wasn't on display. It was nailed behind a door in the back, waiting for someone with nothing left to lose. Settle in, and let us tell you a story of quiet courage and spectacular discovery. We'd love to know where you're watching from tonight. The coach rattled to a halt in the muddy square of Oakhaven, depositing Harriet Mercer and her single worn carpetbag onto the slick cobblestones. Rain, which had been a constant companion for the last 50 miles, fell with a dreary persistence, plastering loose strands of brown hair to her pale cheeks. She was 23, but the last 6 months had etched a decade of weariness into the fine lines around her eyes. Beside her, an old, gray-muzzled dog named Bramble shivered, pressing close to her black sarge skirt for warmth. London was behind her, a place of soot-stained memories and the fresh grief of a father's passing. Their small, book-filled rooms had been surrendered, the landlord's sympathy as thin as winter broth. Her father, a man of gentle scholarship and poor financial sense, had left her with a love for history, a profound sense of duty, and almost no money. After the debts were settled, a final letter from a country solicitor had arrived. It spoke of a distant great-uncle she'd never met, a Mr. Silas Mercer, who had died years ago, leaving behind a single property. The estate had been locked in probate, its value considered so negligible that it had taken years for the bureaucracy to finally declare it hers. The solicitor's letter had been crisp and unsentimental. The property, it stated, was a commercial building, formerly Mercer's Museum of Provincial Antiquities, and was considered derelict. Enclosed was a bank draft for the residual cash from the estate. £3.04. It was quite literally everything she had in the world. Harriet had used the 4 shillings for the coach ticket and clutched the £3 in her hand as if they were the last embers of a dying fire. She had no other prospects, no family to turn to. There was only this forgotten building in this forgotten town. It was a desperate gamble, a step into a future as gray and uncertain as the drizzling sky above her. The townsfolk who scurried past, heads bent under the rain, cast fleeting, curious glances at the stranger and her sad-looking dog. She was an interruption, a new shape in their familiar landscape, and her presence felt as unwelcome as the persistent damp that seeped into everything. She clutched the strap of her bag, the key to the museum cold and heavy inside, and took her first breath of Oakhaven air. It smelled of wet earth, coal smoke, and indifference. Her first official act in Oakhaven was to visit the office of the solicitor, a cramped room smelling of dusty paper and sealing wax. A young, harried clerk looked up from his ledger, his expression one of mild annoyance. When Harriet Mercer stated her name and purpose, a flicker of recognition, mingled with something like pity, crossed his face. "Ah, yes. The Mercer property," he said, not bothering to rise. "We'd nearly written it off the books. You've come to take possession, then?" "I have," Harriet replied, her voice quiet but firm. The clerk sighed, pulling a large iron key from a drawer. "The deed is already in your name. All that remains is the final settlement for the title transfer and outstanding rates. The sum is £3. He named the exact amount she possessed. It was as if he knew. He watched her, a faint, condescending smile on his lips, as she untied the corner of her handkerchief and counted out the heavy coins onto the polished wood of his desk. The sound they made was both solid and final. "There," she said. He swept the coins into a drawer without ceremony and pushed the key and a thick, vellum document across the desk. "She's all yours. Mercer's Folly, as the town calls it. Been a blight on Market Street for 20 years. He offered no words of welcome, no gesture of goodwill. The transaction was complete. He had his money, and she had her ruin. Harriet took the key. It was heavier than she expected, its iron surface pitted with rust. She and Bramble walked the short distance to the address on the deed, and there it was. Tucked between a bustling bakery and a draper's shop, the museum was a narrow, two-story building of gray stone, grim and silent. The paint on the grandly lettered sign, Mercer's Museum of Provincial Antiquities, had peeled away, leaving ghostly outlines of the words. The windows were blind with grime and boarded over from the inside. A thick layer of dust and grime coated the door, and a spider had spun an elaborate web across the keyhole, a testament to how long it had been since anyone had cared to enter. It looked less like a building and more like a gravestone for a forgotten dream. Bramble whined softly, as if sensing the deep well of sadness the place exuded. This was it. This was the sum of her inheritance, the vessel for her last hope. A derelict building bought, with the last of her father's legacy. A place the world had discarded. What would you do with the key to a place no one wanted? What secrets sleep behind a door locked for a generation? A door that even the town's memory has begun to forget. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for the rest of Harriet's journey. For her, holding that cold iron key, the real work was only just beginning. As Harriet stood contemplating the daunting facade of her new property, the life of Oak Haven bustled around her, utterly indifferent. But her presence had not gone unnoticed. From the bakery, the smell of fresh bread was accompanied by the curious stare of the baker's wife. From across the square, two men unloading a dray wagon paused their work, nudging each other and murmuring behind their hands. The whispers were like the rustle of dry leaves, indistinct at first, then coalescing into a clear pattern of amusement and disdain. The name Mercer was passed between them, followed by soft, pitying laughter. She was the fool from the city, the girl who had paid good money for a pile of rubble. The weight of their collective judgment was a physical thing, pressing down on her shoulders. Then a louder voice cut through the quiet condescension. Well, well, if it isn't the new proprietress of Oak Haven's grandest ruin. Harriet turned. A large man in a tweed jacket and riding boots was striding toward her, a silver-topped cane swinging jauntily in his hand. He had a florid, self-satisfied face and the easy posture of a man accustomed to owning every space he entered. This, she would soon learn, was Squire Alistair Finch, a man whose family had risen to prominence in the district over the last 2 generations through shrewd, and some whispered ruthless, land acquisition. He stopped before her, looking from her worn dress to the derelict museum, and let out a booming laugh. I heard a rumor some poor soul had finally taken the Mercer folly off the solicitor's hands. But I confess I didn't picture someone quite so earnest. He gestured dismissively at the building with his cane. Tell me, girl, what do you plan to do with this pile of stones? The rats inside have more claim to it than you do. Harriet felt a flush of heat rise in her cheeks, but she held his gaze. I plan to make it my home, sir. Finch laughed again, louder this time. Your home? Splendid. You'll have the ghosts of failed ambition for company. Listen, he said, his tone shifting to one of magnanimous condescension. I'll do you a favor. I'll give you £5 for the deed. That's a £2 profit for you, and I'll have the pleasure of tearing this eyesore down and expanding my stables. It's a generous offer. Take it and find yourself a decent room at the inn. The offer was tempting. £5 would feed her for weeks, but something in his dismissive smirk, in the way he looked at the building as if it were filth, sparked a stubborn ember of defiance in her. This place was a Mercer legacy, however tarnished. It was hers. Thank you for the offer, sir, she said, her voice low but steady. But it is not for sale. Squire Finch's smile vanished. His eyes narrowed. Suit yourself, he sneered. Don't come crying to me when the roof falls in on you. He turned on his heel and strode away, leaving a wake of silence. The townspeople, who had been watching the exchange, quickly averted their eyes and returned to their business. But the incident had solidified Harriet's status. She was not just a fool, but a stubborn one who had publicly defied the squire. As she stood there, the sting of his words still sharp in her ears, a soft voice spoke from beside her. "He has a heavy hand, that one." Harriet turned to see a very old woman wrapped in a thick black shawl, her face a fine web of wrinkles. Her eyes, however, were startlingly clear and dark. She was looking not at Harriet, but at the museum. "Some doors are nailed shut for a reason, child," the old woman said, her voice raspy with age. "Not always the one you think." Before Harriet could ask what she meant, the woman gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod and shuffled away, disappearing into the alley beside the draper's shop. The cryptic remark hung in the air, a strange and unsettling counterpoint to the squire's open mockery. A warning, or perhaps something else entirely. It was another layer of mystery settling over a place already shrouded in neglect, and it made the cold iron key in her pocket feel heavier than ever. That afternoon, Harriet sought out the carter who had been pointed out to her at the coach station, a man named Mr. Gable. He was a broad-shouldered man with kind eyes who had known her father's family in passing years ago. He listened to her predicament without judgment and agreed to transport her modest bag and a few provisions she'd purchased. A loaf of bread, a wedge of cheese, a precious handful of candles to the museum. He refused payment, accepting only her quiet thanks. When they arrived, he helped her unload her things onto the dusty stoop. "It's a sorry-looking place, Miss Mercer," he said, his gaze taking in the boarded windows and crumbling mortar. "But it's stone and the foundation is sound. That's more than can be said for some." His simple, practical assessment was the first kindness she had received all day, a small anchor in a sea of scorn. After he left, Harriet was alone with her building. The late afternoon sun was beginning its descent, casting long, distorted shadows down the narrow street. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of damp stone and decay. Taking a deep breath, she slid the heavy iron key into the lock. It resisted, coated in years of grime and rust. She had to put her shoulder into it, turning with all her strength until, with a terrible grinding screech, the lock's mechanism gave way. The door groaned open on protesting hinges, revealing not a room but a wall of solid darkness. A wave of musty air, thick with the smell of dust, mold, and time itself, washed over her. It was the smell of a place that had not breathed for a very long time. She fumbled for a candle and a lucifer match, her hands trembling slightly. With a scratch and a flare, a small, flickering light pushed back the oppressive gloom. The sight that met her eyes made her heart sink. It was even worse than she had feared. The front area was a single large hall, cluttered with shapes shrouded in white dustcloths, like a graveyard of forgotten furniture. What little she could see looked like junk. A stuffed badger whose glass eyes stared maniacally into the darkness, a case of broken clay pipes, a stack of browning, water-stained maps. Dust was a thick, soft blanket over everything, disturbed only by the tiny tracks of mice. The air was cold and dead. The silence was absolute, broken only by the drip, drip, drip of water somewhere in the back. This was not a home. It was a tomb. The laughter of Squire Finch and the pitying looks of the townspeople seemed to echo in the cavernous space. They were right. This was Mercer's folly. She had spent her last £3 on a derelict's fantasy. Exhausted and overwhelmed with nowhere else to go, she found a small, slightly less dusty back office. She cleared a space on the floor, laid down her coat, and curled up with Bramble at her side. His warm, solid presence, a small comfort in the crushing dark. She did not weep. The disappointment was a cold, hard stone in her chest, too heavy for tears. As she drifted into a troubled sleep, she could hear the old building settle around her, groaning like a great beast, shifting in its slumber. It felt as if it were watching her, waiting. In the first light of dawn, Filtered gray and weak through the grimy windows, the museum looked even more forlorn. Harriet rose, her body stiff from the hard floor, and began the only thing she knew how to do: work. She would not be defeated by dust and decay. She unboarded one of the front windows, prying away the rotting planks with her bare hands until a rectangle of pale morning light cut through the gloom. The dust motes, ancient and undisturbed, swirled in the beam like a galaxy of tiny stars. For the next few days, she lived a spare and disciplined existence. She swept the floors, the bristles of the old broom raising clouds of history. She pulled the cloths off the exhibits, revealing the sad collection within. There was a case of local birds, their feathers molted and dull, a display of Roman pottery shards, most of them unremarkable, a collection of agricultural tools from a bygone era. It was exactly as Squire Finch had described, the mundane and forgotten relics of the province. Nothing of value, nothing of beauty. It was the hoard of a man with more enthusiasm than taste, a magpie's nest of the ordinary. She ate her bread and cheese sparingly, sharing morsels with Bramble. The dog seemed to sense her fragile state of mind, staying close, his tail giving a slow, reassuring thump whenever she looked his way. At night, the building sounds became her companions: the creak of timber, the scuttling of mice in the walls, the mournful sigh of the wind through a crack in the roof. It was during her methodical cleaning of the ground floor that she first noticed the anomaly. At the very back of the main hall was a door, but it was not like the other doors. This one was made of heavy, dark oak, and was not merely locked. It was sealed. A series of thick, hand-wrought iron nails, their heads rusted and wide as a thumbprint, had been driven through the door into the jamb, pinning it shut. There were at least a dozen of them, hammered in with a grim finality. The wood around them was splintered and dark, as if from great force. Why, she wondered, would someone go to such lengths? A lock could be picked, a key could be lost. But this was an act of deliberate, almost violent sealing. She ran her hand over the rough wood. There was no draft from its edges, no sound from beyond it. It was utterly inert. Yet, as she continued to map out the building in her mind, another detail refused to fit. Standing outside on the street, she paced the length of the building's stone wall. Then she returned inside and paced the interior. There was a discrepancy. The interior was several feet shorter than the exterior. A section of the building, the section that lay directly behind the nailed door, was unaccounted for. It was dead space, or more accurately, hidden space. That evening, as she sat with her candle, she noticed Bramble had taken to lying near that back wall. He did not sleep, but lay with his head on his paws, facing the sealed door. Every so often he would lift his head, his ears would prick, and a low, almost inaudible growl would rumble in his chest. He was sensing something she could not. Something on the other side of that wall. The sealed door became an obsession. It was a question mark at the heart of her inheritance. The dog's strange vigilance only deepened the mystery. Bramble would spend hours near the wall, sniffing intently at the floorboards near the base of the door, his tail held low and still. Harriet, kneeling beside him, felt it too. A faint, almost imperceptible current of air rising from between two of the old oak planks. It was different from the damp, musty drafts elsewhere in the building. This air was cool, but it was dry, and it carried a scent she couldn't quite place. Something clean and ancient, like the inside of a long, unopened book. The cryptic warning from the old woman, Elspeth, echoed in her mind. Some doors are nailed shut for a reason, not always the one you think. The town thought the museum was a failure, a folly. But what if its purpose wasn't what it seemed? What if the public museum was merely a facade, a drab and uninteresting shell built to conceal something else entirely? The thought took root and grew into a conviction. She had to open that door. This decision required a sacrifice. Tools were needed, and she had no money. Rummaging through her meager possessions, Her fingers closed around the one object of sentimental and monetary value she had left. A small silver locket her mother had given her, containing a miniature portrait of her parents on their wedding day. It was the last tangible piece of them she owned. For a moment, her resolve wavered. Selling it felt like a betrayal. But then she looked at the sealed door, at the patient, watchful form of her dog, and knew she had no choice. Her past had brought her here to this place of dust and secrets. To move forward, she had to risk the last of it. She sold the locket at the town's small pawn shop for a pittance. The shopkeeper gave her a few shillings, his eyes full of the same pity she saw everywhere. With the coins, she did not buy food or a warm blanket. She bought a sturdy crowbar and a heavy-headed hammer. Returning to the museum, the tools felt alien and purposeful in her hands. This was no longer an act of cleaning or tidying. It was an act of excavation. Bramble seemed to understand. As she approached the door, he rose to his feet, a low whine in his throat, and stood back, watching. The work was brutal. The nails were old, hammered deep into the dense oak of the doorframe. She wedged the tip of the crowbar under the first nailhead and threw her entire weight against it. The metal groaned in protest, but the nail did not budge. Her hands, already chapped from cleaning, were soft and unaccustomed to such labor. Sweat beaded on her brow. She tried again and again. Finally, with a screech of tortured metal, the nail began to move. One by one, over the course of the next day, she fought with the nails. Each one was a battle. The wood splintered, her palms blistered, then broke open and bled. She wrapped them in strips torn from her petticoat and kept working, driven by a force she didn't understand. It was as if she were pulling the nails not just from a door, but from her own life, freeing herself from the inertia of grief and poverty. As she worked on the lower part of the door, her fingers, tracing the splintered wood, found something else. Half hidden by the jam was a small, deliberately carved mark. It was no accidental scratch. It was a symbol no bigger than her thumb, the stylized shape of a bird with a sharp beak and a crest. A finch, the name of the squire. A cold dread mingled with excitement washed over her. The door was not just sealed, it was marked. The last nail gave way with a final groaning shriek and fell to the floor with a clang that echoed in the silent hall. The door, free for the first time in decades, shifted slightly in its frame, a dark line of shadow appearing at its edge. It was ready. With the last nail removed, a profound silence fell over the hall. Harriet stood back, her chest heaving, her hands raw and aching. The crowbar fell from her grasp with a heavy thud. For a long moment she simply stared at the door, a dark, silent rectangle that had consumed all of her energy and hope. Taking a deep, ragged breath, she placed her hand on the wood and pushed. It swung inward without a sound, opening onto a darkness more complete than any she had yet encountered. A wave of air, cool and impossibly still, washed over her, carrying a scent that was now unmistakable. Old paper, dry leather, beeswax, and the faint metallic tang of cold coin. It was the smell of preservation. She lifted her candle, its small flame trembling, and stepped across the threshold. Bramble followed, staying close to her heels, his customary whine split a tense silence. The light pushed back the darkness inch by inch, revealing not a dusty storage room, but a chamber that had been deliberately and meticulously arranged. Against the far wall stood a heavy oak desk, its surface clear save for a single, thick, leather-bound ledger. To its left, stacked neatly, were a dozen wooden crates, their lids sealed with dark red wax. To its right, arranged in a row upon the floor, were 3 large, iron-banded strongboxes, their locks intricate and formidable. The walls were lined not with shelves of curios, but with tall, narrow cabinets of dark wood, their glass doors locked. The room was not a forgotten closet, it was a vault, a sanctuary. Her heart hammering against her ribs, Harriet approached the desk. She ran her fingers over the smooth, cool leather of the ledger. With trembling hands, she opened it. The first page was headed in elegant cursive script, an inventory of the Mercer legacy, salvaged. She turned the page. The book was filled with entries, each one written in the same precise hand. It was a catalogue of treasures. Item: 1 Saxon gold torque, unearthed at the Sutton Field, 1821. Item: a collection of 48 Roman silver denarii, found near the old bathhouse ruins. Item: 1 illuminated psalter, English, circa 1340. Each entry was followed by the brief note on its provenance, and a name. Her breath caught in her throat. The names were all the same. Acquired from the estate of Jonathan Mercer, purchased from the widow of Thomas Mercer, recovered from the debt sale of William Mercer's library. It was a litany of her own ancestors. This wasn't a random collection. This was a systematic reclamation of her family's lost heritage. Driven by a frantic energy, she turned her attention to the crates. Using the crowbar, she pried the lid from the nearest one. The wax seal shattered. Inside, nestled in straw, lay not junk but priceless artifacts. Golden brooches, silver arm rings, delicate pieces of jewelry that gleamed softly in the candlelight. It was a king's ransom, a treasure trove of immense historical and monetary value. She felt dizzy, leaning against the desk for support. In a small drawer, her fingers found a sealed envelope, the paper yellowed with age. The front simply read, "For my heir." She broke the seal. The letter was from Silas Mercer, her great-uncle, the museum's founder. His words, written in a fading but resolute hand, laid the truth bare. He described how his branch of the family had watched for 2 generations as their cousins, the Finches, had married into, swindled, and legally dispossessed the Mercer clan of its lands and wealth. Silas, a quiet scholar with a modest inheritance, had devoted his life to one secret purpose: to buy back what he could of their stolen legacy before it was lost forever. The museum was his cover, its collection of worthless junk the perfect camouflage. He had built it not as a business, but as a fortress to house the true Mercer fortune, hiding it behind a nailed door, waiting for a Mercer with enough grit and desperation to find it. She was holding the proof, the truth that could undo the wealthiest family in Oakhaven. Harriet sat for hours in the silent vault, the letter in her lap, the ledger open before her. The candlelight cast a warm glow on the gold and silver, but a cold dread settled in her heart. This discovery was not a simple matter of finding treasure. It was unearthing a generational crime. The name carved into the door jamb, the Finch, was not a warning, but a signature of the thief. Squire Alistair Finch's wealth, his power, his very position in the town, was built upon the ruin of her family. His open contempt for her was the contempt of a usurper for the rightful heir. News, even in a town like Oakhaven, traveled on the wind. The sound of her labor, the splintering of wood and the screech of nails, had not gone entirely unnoticed. Rumors began to circulate that the mad girl in the Folly had broken into the sealed back room. By midday, those rumors reached the ears of the squire himself. He did not wait for an invitation. The front door of the museum slammed open, and Alistair Finch stormed in, his face purple with rage. "What is the meaning of this?" he boomed, his voice echoing in the hall. "I hear you've been destroying the property. Where are you, girl?" Harriet emerged from the hidden chamber, closing the heavy door behind her, though not locking it. She stood before him, pale but composed, the ledger held tightly in her hands. Finch's eyes darted to the newly opened doorway. Avarice and suspicion warred in his expression. "So you got it open. What did you find? Old Silas's junk? Whatever it is, it's part of the property. And as I hold the note on half the businesses in this street, I have a vested interest. I'm warning you, touch nothing." He took a step toward her, his hand outstretched as if to snatch the ledger. As he spoke, the sky outside, which had been growing steadily darker, finally broke. A sudden, violent clap of thunder shook the building, and rain began to lash against the windows. It was no gentle shower, but a ferocious summer squall. Wind howled down the street, and water began to stream through the cracks in the museum's neglected roof, dripping onto the dusty exhibits. Just as Finch was about to threaten her further, a frantic banging came from the front door. A man's voice, desperate and thin against the roar of the storm, cried out for help. Finch ignored it, his attention fixed on Harriet. But Harriet pushed past him. She threw open the door to find a young family, a man, a woman, and a small, whimpering child, huddled on the stoop, drenched and shivering. Their cart, visible down the street, had a broken wheel. "Please," the man begged. "Our little girl, she's taken ill with a fever. We must get out of this deluge." Without a moment's hesitation, Harriet ushered them inside. "Come in, quickly." She led them away from the main hall where the leaks were growing worse, and into the one place she knew was dry and safe, the hidden vault. She settled the mother and child on a pile of old blankets she'd found, while the father stared in wide-eyed wonder at the crates and strongboxes. Finch, thwarted and furious, watched her with utter contempt. "You would shelter vagrants in the middle of this?" "I will be back," he snarled. With the constable, he turned and strode out into the storm. That night, as the tempest raged outside, Harriet chose her path. She tended to the sick child with cool cloths, shared her meager loaf of bread with the grateful parents, and worked to move the most vulnerable artifacts away from the damp. Surrounded by her family's reclaimed history and the desperate plight of strangers, the weight of her decision settled. This was not about personal wealth or revenge. It was about stewardship. She would protect this legacy, and she would use it to restore a truth that had been buried for far too long. The storm was a test, and she had met it not with greed, but with compassion. As dawn broke, the rain subsided, revealing a world washed clean, and on her doorstep, just as he had promised, stood Squire Finch, the town constable, at his side. The morning light was pale and watery as it filtered into the museum. Squire Finch stood with his arms crossed, a smug, vindictive expression on his face. The constable, a weary-looking man named Miller, looked uncomfortable. "Constable," Finch declared, his voice ringing with authority, "I want this woman arrested for breaking and entering this property's sealed quarters, and for harboring vagrants." Before the constable could respond, the young father stepped forward from the vault's doorway. "Sir, this woman gave my family shelter from the storm. Our daughter was sick. She showed us nothing but kindness." "She is a trespasser and a thief," Finch retorted. At that moment, another figure appeared in the open doorway. It was Mr. Davies, the town's senior solicitor, an elderly man with a reputation for scrupulous honesty. He was accompanied by Mr. Gable, the carter, who looked grimly determined. Gable had seen the squire heading for the constable's office and, fearing the worst, had gone straight to the one man in town Finch couldn't bully. "Alistair," Mr. Davies said, his voice calm but firm, "perhaps we should ascertain the facts before we speak of arrests." Finch's face tightened. "The facts are plain, Davies. She broke into a sealed room." "Perhaps," Harriet said, her voice quiet but carrying in the sudden silence. She stepped forward and held out the leather-bound ledger to the solicitor. "You should read this first, Mr. Davies." She did not raise her voice, did not make a single accusation. She simply offered the evidence. Mr. Davies took the book, put on his spectacles, and began to read. The room was silent save for the dripping of water and the rustle of the turning pages. The townspeople, drawn by the commotion, had gathered outside, peering in through the door and the newly cleared window. They watched as the solicitor's expression shifted from professional curiosity to gravity, and then to astonishment. He read pages from the inventory, then Silas Mercer's signed and dated confession. He looked at the detailed account of how the Finch family had systematically plundered the Mercer estate. Finally, he closed the book. He removed his spectacles and polished them slowly, before looking directly at Alistair Finch. "Squire," he said, and his quiet voice seemed to amplify in the hall. This ledger appears to be a meticulously kept account of property belonging to the Mercer family. Property your grandfather appears to have acquired through questionable means. This letter, he held up the confession, is a sworn statement to that effect, witnessed by the vicar of this parish at the time. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. This is not a matter for the constable. It is a matter of inheritance. A very significant inheritance. A collective gasp went through the crowd of onlookers. Finch's face went from purple to a sickly white. He opened his mouth to bluster, to deny, but the solicitor's unimpeachable reputation and the solid factual weight of the ledger were too much. He saw the looks on the faces of the townspeople. The whispers were no longer about the foolish girl, but about him. The foundation of his authority, built on a lie, had crumbled in an instant. Without another word, Alistair Finch turned and pushed his way through the crowd, his head bowed. He was not defeated by a battle, but by a quiet truth, brought to light by a woman he had dismissed as worthless. The community's gaze shifted to Harriet, no longer with mockery or pity, but with a new and startling reverence. In the weeks that followed, the story of Harriet Mercer and the hidden treasure became the legend of Oakhaven. The contents of the vault were even more significant than first imagined. Antiquarians from London and academics from Oxford arrived, their quiet excitement a stark contrast to the town's previous scorn. They examined the Saxon gold, the Roman coins, the medieval manuscripts, confirming their authenticity and immense value. The name Mercer, once a byword for folly, was now spoken with awe. The Finch family, faced with irrefutable proof and public disgrace, crumbled. Quietly, through solicitors, they began to make reparations, their vast land holdings shrinking as justice, delayed by 2 generations, was finally served. They did not flee the town, but remained, humbled and diminished, a living testament to the fact that truth, no matter how deeply buried, will eventually find its way to the light. Harriet, however, did not sell the collection. She did not take her newfound wealth and disappear. Instead, with a significant advance secured by Mr. Davies against the collection's value, she began the slow, careful work of restoration. The first thing she did was hire a roofer to repair the damage from the storm. Then she hired the father of the child she had sheltered, a skilled carpenter, to replace the rotten floorboards and mend the broken window frames. The townspeople, who had once laughed at her, now offered their help. The baker's wife brought fresh bread and hot soup each day. The draper gave her bolts of clean linen to polish the glass cases. Mr. Gable used his cart to haul away decades of rubbish, revealing the building's sound stone structure. The museum was coming back to life, not as a private vault, but as a public trust, piece by painstaking piece. It was no longer Mercer's folly. It was becoming Oakhaven's pride. One evening, as the golden hour light streamed through the clean windows of the main hall, Harriet stood surveying the progress. The dust was gone. The displays were being cleaned and thoughtfully rearranged. The air smelled of beeswax and lemon oil. Bramble, now old and content, slept peacefully on a rug by the door. Mr. Davies stood beside her, looking at the transformation. "It is truly remarkable, Miss Mercer," he said. "You have built something wonderful from the ashes of the past. What will you call it? The new Mercer Museum?" Harriet looked around the quiet, ordered space, at the history she had rescued from silence and neglect. A soft smile touched her lips. "I haven't built a museum," she murmured, her voice carrying the quiet conviction that had sustained her all along. "I have paid a debt to memory. Thank you for staying with us for this story of quiet determination. It's a powerful reminder of the enduring power of quiet stewardship and how the things we inherit are so much more than just objects." If you were moved by Harriet's journey, please give this video a like and let us know your favorite moment in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe for more tales of hidden history and unexpected discoveries. We'll see you next time.